They were told Americans would strip them naked, mock their bodies, and leave them to bleed in shame. But when 247 German women prisoners stepped off the transport trucks at Camp Rustin, Louisiana, in June 1945, the enemy broke them not with humiliation, but with small white packages wrapped in brown paper. They expected degradation. Instead, they received something they hadn't seen in 3 years: sanitary napkins, handed to them quietly by soldiers who looked away to preserve their dignity, and in that moment, everything they had been taught about the enemy began to crumble. If you want to hear more untold stories from World War II, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Now let's dive into this remarkable story. The Louisiana heat hit them like a wall. After weeks crossing the Atlantic in the belly of a cargo ship, then days rattling across America in stuffy train cars, the 247 German women finally arrived at their destination. The truck engines went silent and dust settled around the convoy. Through the canvas flaps, they could see guard towers rising against a blazing summer sky. Barbed wire stretched in neat lines, but the camp beyond looked nothing like the concentration camps they had heard whispers about. The buildings were painted, paths were swept clean, American flags snapped in the hot breeze. These women were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were Helferinnen, military auxiliaries who had served the Wehrmacht as radio operators, nurses, clerks, and spotters. Their gray-green uniforms were stained with weeks of travel. Their hair hung limp and dirty. Most were between 19 and 30 years old. Some clutched small bags containing their only possessions: a photograph, a letter, a small Bible. Others had nothing at all. As they climbed down from the trucks, the smell hit them first. It was completely unexpected. Instead of the stench of unwashed bodies and fear they had braced themselves for, they smelled something else: fried chicken, fresh bread, coffee. The scents drifted from a building nearby, and several women stopped in their tracks, confused. One woman, Greta, a former nurse from Hamburg, whispered to her companion, "Is this a trick? Why does it smell like someone's kitchen?" The guards motioned them forward with their rifles, but their voices were calm, almost bored. "Move along, ladies, single file. Keep your belongings with you." The English words sounded strange, but the tone was not harsh. It was matter of fact, professional. The women had expected shouting, maybe blows. Instead, they got efficiency. They were herded toward a processing building, their boots scraping against the gravel. Some trembled despite the heat. Others held their heads high, determined not to show fear. But every single one of them felt their chests tighten with dread as they approached the entrance. This was it. This was where the Americans would finally show their true nature. This was where the humiliation would begin. Greta's hands shook as she gripped her small bag. She thought of the stories they had heard during the war. Stories of American brutality, of prisoners tortured and mocked. She thought of her younger sister back home in the ruins of Hamburg and wondered if she would ever see her again. Around her, other women whispered quick prayers or simply stared straight ahead, their faces blank with fear. Wait. The fear lingered. Every step felt like walking toward an execution. But the American soldiers at the door just checked clipboards and waved them inside. No violence, no screaming. Just paperwork and tired-looking men in uniform who barely glanced at them. Inside the building, confusion replaced terror. The processing room was large and surprisingly cool. Fans whirred in the corners, moving the thick Louisiana air. Tables were set up in rows, each staffed by American soldiers with forms and pens. The women were directed to form lines, and one by one, their names were recorded, their belongings catalogued. Greta watched as the soldier in front of her wrote down her information with careful handwriting. He never looked at her with hatred. He just did his job. Then came the medical checks. The women were directed to a side room where two female American nurses waited. This was the moment they had truly feared. In Germany, during the final years of the war, medical examinations had become brutal affairs, with exhausted doctors who had no time for gentleness. The women expected worse from the enemy, but the nurses smiled. Not with mockery, but with something that looked almost like sympathy. "Hello," one said in broken German. "We check health. You sit, please." Her accent was terrible, but her face was kind. Greta sat on a wooden chair, and the nurse checked her pulse, looked at her eyes, and examined her arms for injuries or illness. The touch was gentle, professional. The nurse made notes on a clipboard and then handed Greta a small card with her health status. "You are okay," she said. "A little thin, but okay. We feed you good here." After the medical check, they were taken to the showers. The women tensed again. Being forced to undress in front of the enemy was exactly the kind of degradation they had been warned about. But they were directed into a large tile room with privacy curtains separating individual shower stalls. No one watched them, no one leered. They were simply handed bars of soap, thick, white, and smelling faintly of lavender, and told to wash. The water was hot. Greta stood under the stream and felt months of grime wash away. She had not bathed properly since before the surrender. In the chaos of Germany's collapse, water had been scarce, and hot water had been a distant memory. Now in the enemy's camp, she had more hot water than she knew what to do with. She pressed her hands against the tile wall and felt tears mix with the water running down her face. It was not cruelty, but kindness, and that made it even more confusing. When she emerged, clean for the first time in months, she was handed a towel and a set of plain work clothes. No humiliating prison uniforms, just simple cotton shirts and trousers, clean and worn, but serviceable. As she dressed, Greta caught sight of herself in a small mirror on the wall. Her face was gaunt, her hair plastered wet against her skull, but her skin was clean. She looked almost human again. That night, Greta wrote in a small notebook she had managed to keep hidden in her belongings. They gave us soap, real soap, hot water. I do not understand. We are the enemy. Why do they treat us this way? I expected cruelty. Instead, I feel clean for the first time in a year. What kind of enemy does this? After showers and fresh clothes, the women were marched to the mess hall. The building was large, with long wooden tables and benches. The smell of food was overwhelming. Greta's stomach twisted with hunger and confusion. She had not eaten a full meal in weeks. During the final days before capture, rations had been reduced to hard bread and thin soup. Many of the women looked like walking skeletons. They formed a line at the serving counter, and American cooks in white aprons scooped food onto metal trays. Greta stared at what landed on her plate. Mashed potatoes, thick and buttery. Green beans. A piece of fried chicken, golden and steaming. A roll with a pat of butter. And in a small bowl, a fruit cocktail with syrup. She stood frozen, tray in her hands, unable to believe it. The woman behind her bumped into her, and Greta stumbled forward to a table. She sat down, surrounded by other women who were equally stunned. For a long moment, no one ate. They just stared at the food. Then slowly, Greta picked up her fork and tasted the mashed potatoes. The flavor exploded in her mouth, rich, salty, real. She had to put a hand over her mouth to stop herself from sobbing. Around the table, other women began to eat. Some cried openly. Others ate in complete silence, their hands trembling. One woman pushed her tray away and put her head in her hands, unable to reconcile the food in front of her with the stories she had been told. "My mother is eating bark soup," whispered a young woman named Liesel, sitting across from Greta. Her eyes were red with tears. "My baby brother has rickets because there is no milk. And here I have butter. Real butter." She picked up the roll, stared at it, and then bit into it almost angrily, as if the act of eating was a betrayal. But the strangest moment came at the end of the meal. As the women filed out of the mess hall, each was handed a small bar of chocolate. Hershey's chocolate, wrapped in brown paper with silver lettering. Greta turned the bar over in her hands, unable to believe it was real. Chocolate. She had not seen chocolate since before the war. In Germany, chocolate had disappeared years ago, traded or sold on black markets for absurd prices. That night, lying in her bunk in the barracks, Greta broke off a small piece of the chocolate and let it melt on her tongue. The sweetness was almost painful. She thought of her sister, only 14 years old, who had never tasted anything so wonderful. She thought of the children in Hamburg, digging through rubble for scraps of food. And here she was, a prisoner of war, eating chocolate. She wrote in her notebook again, "They feed us like we are guests, not prisoners. The food is better than what we ate even before the war. I do not know what to feel. Grateful, ashamed, both." The barracks were simple but clean. Rows of metal bunk beds lined the walls, each with a thin mattress, a pillow, and 2 wool blankets. Compared to the bombed-out cellars and crowded shelters the women had known in Germany, it was almost comfortable. There was a wood stove in the center of the room for winter, though in the Louisiana summer it sat cold and unused. Windows let in fresh air and light. Each woman was assigned a bed and a small wooden locker where she could store personal items. Greta placed her few belongings inside: her notebook, a photograph of her sister, a small carved wooden cross her father had given her. The locker even had a key. She could lock it. They were being given privacy, something she had not experienced in months. As night fell, the women gathered in small groups, whispering to each other. The shock of the day was starting to wear off, replaced by a deep confusion. In one corner, a group of older women prayed together, their voices low and rhythmic. In another, younger women sat on the floor, passing around the chocolate bars, breaking off small pieces to savor. Greta sat on her bunk and watched them. A woman named Frida, who had been a telephone operator in Berlin, climbed onto the bunk across from her. "I do not trust this," Frida said quietly. "The kindness is a trick. Tomorrow or the next day they will show their true faces. No one treats the enemy this way." But another woman, older, with gray streaks in her hair, shook her head. "I have been a nurse for 20 years. I have seen cruelty. What we experienced today was not cruelty. It was something else. I do not know what, but it was not cruelty." The conversations continued late into the night. Some women clung to their suspicions, convinced the Americans were softening them up for some greater humiliation. Others allowed themselves to feel the first tiny flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they would survive this. Maybe captivity would not be the nightmare they had imagined. Greta lay on her bunk, staring at the dark ceiling. Outside, cicadas buzzed in the humid night. It was a sound completely foreign to her, wild and loud. She thought about the soap, the hot water, the chicken, the chocolate, and she thought about what tomorrow might bring. She did not know it yet, but tomorrow would bring something even more unexpected. Something that would make many of them cry not from fear, but from relief. The morning bell rang at 6 o'clock, jarring the women awake. Greta sat up, disoriented for a moment, before remembering where she was. Around her, other women stirred, climbing down from bunks and pulling on their work clothes. They filed outside to wash their faces at the communal sinks and then lined up for breakfast. Breakfast was porridge with brown sugar, toast with jam, and coffee. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute they had drunk in Germany. The portions were generous. Greta ate slowly, still not quite believing the food was real. At her table, Liesel was spreading jam on her toast with an expression that was half wonder, half guilt. After breakfast, the women were divided into work groups. Some were assigned to the camp laundry, washing uniforms and linens. Others worked in the kitchen, peeling potatoes and preparing vegetables. A group was sent to work in the camp garden, tending rows of tomatoes, beans, and squash. The work was not hard. It was nothing like the brutal labor camps they had heard about. It was just regular work, the kind of work they might have done at home. And they were paid. Not much, just a few dollars a week in camp scrip, but it was something. The scrip could be used at the camp canteen, a small store that sold cigarettes, candy, soap, and even lipstick. The first time Greta walked into the canteen and saw the shelves stocked with goods, she felt dizzy. In Germany, stores had been empty for years. Here, in a prison camp, there was abundance. She bought a pack of cigarettes and a small tin of hand cream. The cigarettes were a luxury she had not enjoyed in years. The hand cream smelled like roses. That evening, sitting outside the barracks with Frida and Liesel, she shared her cigarettes, and they sat smoking in the warm evening air, watching the sunset over the Louisiana pines. It felt almost normal, almost peaceful. But the contradiction gnawed at them. Every meal, every small comfort, every moment of relative peace was a reminder of how different this was from what they had expected. And more importantly, it was a stark contrast to what their families were suffering back home. 3 weeks into their captivity, the first letters from Germany arrived. The mail call was announced after dinner, and the women crowded around the American soldier reading names from envelopes. When Greta heard her name, her heart leapt. She tore open the envelope and recognized her sister's handwriting immediately. She sat on her bunk and read by the fading evening light. Her sister's words were careful, censored, but the reality bled through. Their apartment building had been destroyed in a bombing raid. They were living in the cellar of a neighbor's house, 12 people sharing 3 rooms. Food was scarce. Her sister wrote about boiling potato peels for soup, about trading their mother's jewelry for a loaf of bread, about children in their neighborhood dying from hunger and disease. Greta read the letter 3 times, and then she folded it carefully and pressed it against her chest. Around her, other women were reading their own letters, and the barracks had fallen silent except for quiet weeping. The contrast was unbearable. Here they were, eating fried chicken and mashed potatoes, sleeping in clean beds, while their families starved in ruins. That night Greta could not eat her dinner. She stared at the plate of food, at the thick slices of roast beef and the pile of buttered carrots, and felt her throat close with shame. Liesel, sitting beside her, pushed her own plate away. "I cannot," she whispered. "How can I eat this when my family has nothing?" But not eating did not help anyone. The food would only be thrown away. And so eventually they ate, but every bite was laced with guilt. The kindness of their captors had become a burden almost too heavy to bear. The Americans noticed the change. The guards who had grown somewhat familiar with the German women over the weeks saw the tears, the untouched meals, the withdrawn expressions. One guard, a young man from Texas named Corporal Davis, asked through an interpreter what was wrong. When he learned about the letters, he just nodded slowly. "War's tough on everybody," he said, "but you can't help them by starving yourself here." His words were logical, but they did not ease the guilt. Despite the guilt, despite the confusion, life in the camp developed a rhythm. And within that rhythm, small moments of humanity began to emerge. Moments that made it even harder to see the Americans as the monsters they had been taught to fear. Greta worked in the laundry, and her supervisor was a middle-aged American sergeant named Mary O'Brien. Sergeant O'Brien was stern but fair, and she quickly learned the names of the German women under her command. One afternoon, Greta made a mistake, washing a batch of uniforms in water that was too hot, causing some shrinkage. She braced herself for punishment, but Sergeant O'Brien just sighed and said, "Well, lesson learned. Next time, check the temperature first. Don't worry about it. No punishment, no yelling, just a shrug and a reminder to do better next time." Greta was stunned. Another day, Corporal Davis brought a phonograph to the barracks and played records for the women. American music, big band jazz, and swing. The women listened, fascinated by the unfamiliar rhythms. Some of the younger ones even began to sway, and soon, despite themselves, they were smiling. Davis grinned and showed them a few simple dance steps. For half an hour in a prison camp in Louisiana, German prisoners and American guards danced to Glenn Miller. It was absurd. It was impossible. But it was real. Frida, who had remained suspicious of American intentions, began to soften. She learned a few English phrases and started teaching English words to the younger women. Thank you. Please. Good morning. The Americans in turn learned bits of German. Guten Tag. Danke. Language became a bridge. One evening, Greta was sitting outside the barracks, writing a letter to her sister, when Corporal Davis approached. He held out a chocolate bar. For your letter, he said in halting German, to send home. Greta stared at the chocolate, then at him. He smiled awkwardly and placed it on the bench beside her before walking away. She never did send the chocolate. It would not have survived the journey. But the gesture itself, the thought that this American soldier cared enough to offer something for her family, shook her to the core. She wrote about it to her sister anyway, describing the kindness of strangers who were supposed to be enemies. Memory collided with reality every single day. The propaganda had promised monsters. Reality delivered human beings. As summer turned to autumn, the women had been in the camp for nearly 4 months. Their bodies had changed. The gaunt, hollow-cheeked women who had arrived in June were now healthier. Their skin had color. Their hair was clean and shiny. Some had even gained weight, their clothes fitting snugly where they had once hung loose. But their minds were in turmoil. The cognitive dissonance between what they had been taught and what they were experiencing had become impossible to ignore. Greta lay awake many nights, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. She had been raised to believe in the righteousness of Germany. She had believed in the Führer's vision of a strong, unified nation. She had served that vision willingly, working as a nurse for the Wehrmacht, caring for wounded soldiers, believing she was doing good. But now, lying in an American prison camp, eating American food, treated with unexpected dignity, she had to confront an uncomfortable truth. If the Americans were the evil monsters they had been told about, why were they being treated so well? And if the Americans were not monsters, what did that say about everything she had believed? It was not cruelty, but kindness that was breaking her. Cruelty she could have resisted. Cruelty would have confirmed everything she had been taught. But kindness demanded that she rethink everything. One evening, a group of women gathered in the barracks for a quiet discussion. The debate had been building for weeks, whispered in corners and during work breaks, but now it came into the open. Frida, who had been so suspicious at first, was the one who started it. We need to talk about this, she said. We need to talk about what this means. An older woman named Hilda, a former schoolteacher, spoke up. What this means is that we were lied to. Our government lied to us about the enemy. They told us the Americans were barbarians, but look at how we are treated. With dignity. With humanity. A younger woman, barely 20, shook her head stubbornly. This is just propaganda from the other side. They treat us well to make us betray our country. But Greta found herself speaking before she could stop herself. Betray our country? Our country betrayed us. Our country left us to starve while our leaders lived in luxury. Our country bombed our own cities into rubble and then blamed the enemy. The Americans did not do this to us. We did it to ourselves. The words hung in the air. Several women gasped. To speak against the fatherland, even in defeat, felt like treason. But others nodded slowly, their faces troubled but thoughtful. Liesel spoke quietly. I think about my brother. He was 16 when they conscripted him. He died at Stalingrad, and for what? So our leaders could chase their mad dreams? The Americans did not kill him. Our own leaders did. The conversations continued night after night. Some women clung desperately to their old beliefs, unwilling to let go of the world they had known. Others, like Greta, felt those beliefs crumbling like ash in their hands. The truth was too stark to deny. They had been treated better by the enemy than they had ever been treated by their own government. The discussion spread throughout the camp. Different women responded in different ways. Some of the older women, who had lived through World War I and remembered the hardships of that defeat, were more willing to accept the new reality. They had seen Germany lie before. Younger women, who had been raised entirely under the Reich's propaganda, struggled more. But slowly, undeniably, a shift was happening. The women were beginning to see their American captors not as enemies, but as people, and in seeing them as people, they were forced to confront their own humanity as well. The camp administration, recognizing the opportunity, began to offer educational programs. Films were shown in the mess hall on Sunday evenings. Not propaganda films, but documentaries about American history, about democracy, about the freedoms guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. The films were subtitled in German, and the women watched with fascination. One film showed the American judicial system, the idea that every person, even the accused, had rights. Another showed elections, ordinary people voting for their leaders. These concepts were foreign to women who had known only authoritarian rule. After one such film, Greta sat with a group of women discussing what they had seen. Can you imagine, she said, Ordinary people choosing their leaders. Not being told who to follow, but actually choosing. "It sounds like chaos," said one woman. "Maybe," said Hilda, the teacher. "Or maybe it sounds like freedom." The word hung in the air. Freedom. It was a word they had heard often in Germany, but always in the context of freedom from enemies, freedom through strength. Never freedom to think, to question, to choose. The most dangerous weapon the Americans wielded was not bullets or bombs. It was dignity. By treating the German women as human beings worthy of respect, the Americans forced them to question everything they had been taught about superiority, about strength, about what it meant to be civilized. As autumn deepened and the Louisiana heat finally began to ease, the women had been in captivity for nearly 6 months. The transformation was nearly complete. Most of them no longer saw themselves as prisoners in the traditional sense. They were simply women living in a strange place, doing their work, writing their letters, and waiting for a future they could not quite imagine. But the deepest realization came not from grand gestures or philosophical discussions. It came from something small, something intimate, something that had been missing from their lives for years. It was October when the American administration made an announcement. The women were gathered in the mess hall after dinner, and a female officer stood at the front of the room with an interpreter. "Ladies," she said, "we have been informed that many of you have been dealing with certain personal difficulties. We want you to know that supplies are available for your monthly needs. Please see Sergeant O'Brien or any of the female staff and we will provide what you need." At first, the women did not quite understand. Then the meaning sank in. Sanitary napkins, feminine hygiene products, things they had not seen in years. During the war, as Germany's economy collapsed, such products had become luxuries most women could not afford. They had managed with rags, with newspapers, with whatever they could find. The humiliation and discomfort of menstruation had become just another hardship in a long list of hardships. And now the Americans were offering to provide these products, not as a luxury, but as a basic necessity, as something every woman deserved. The next day, Greta stood in line outside Sergeant O'Brien's office with dozens of other women. When her turn came, she stepped inside, her face burning with embarrassment. Sergeant O'Brien smiled kindly and handed her a brown paper package. Inside were sanitary napkins, clean and white, along with a small pamphlet in German explaining how to use them and how to request more when needed. Greta clutched the package and felt tears spring to her eyes. It was such a small thing, such a basic thing, but in that moment it represented something much larger. It represented the acknowledgement that they were not just prisoners, not just enemies, but human beings with basic needs and dignity. That night the barracks were filled with quiet crying. Women sat on their bunks, holding the packages, overwhelmed by a kindness they had never expected. Liesel whispered to Greta, "Why do they care? We are nothing to them. Why do they care about this?" Greta shook her head, unable to answer, but she thought she understood. The Americans were not showing kindness to be manipulative or to win propaganda points. They were showing kindness because they believed all people deserved basic dignity. Even enemies, even prisoners. It was a philosophy so foreign to what they had known in Germany, where strength was everything and weakness was despised, where the individual was nothing and the state was everything. Here, even in captivity, they were being treated as individuals who mattered. If the enemy values our lives, Greta thought, why did we not? Perhaps captivity is revealing more truth than freedom ever did. Perhaps kindness cuts deeper than cruelty because it forces us to see our own humanity reflected back at us. It was late November when everything came to a head. Winter was approaching, even in Louisiana, and the evenings had grown cool. The women had been in the camp for 5 months and life had settled into something almost normal. But beneath the surface, the internal struggle continued. Greta sat on her bunk one evening, her notebook open in her lap. She had been writing in it almost every day, documenting her thoughts, her fears, her confusions. Now she read back through the pages, watching her own transformation unfold in ink. The woman who had written the first entries, terrified and full of propaganda-fed hatred, seemed like a stranger. That woman had expected monsters and torture. That woman had been prepared to die defending beliefs she had never questioned. But the woman Greta had become was different. She had been forced to question everything. And in questioning, she had found uncomfortable truths. She picked up her pen and wrote, "I fear leaving more than I feared arriving. What does that say about me? That I am a coward? A traitor? Or simply that I have finally opened my eyes?" The words blurred as tears fell on the page. She set down the pen and pressed her hands to her face. Around her, other women were settling in for the night, some reading letters, some chatting quietly, some already asleep. Normal. It had all become so terribly normal. That night, Greta dreamed of Hamburg. She dreamed of the ruins, the hunger, the endless gray despair. She dreamed of her sister's thin face, her mother's hollow eyes, and when she woke in the morning, lying in her clean bed with her wool blanket and her pillow, she felt the full weight of her transformation crash down on her. She was not the same person who had arrived in June. The enemy's greatest weapon had not been violence. It had been soap, food, chocolate, and sanitary napkins. Simple human kindness. And those things had done what bombs and bullets never could. They had changed her mind, they had changed her heart. A few weeks later, on a cold December morning, the announcement came. A group of prisoners would be repatriated soon. They would be sent back to Germany to rejoin what remained of their families. Names would be posted by the end of the week. The women received the news in stunned silence. Going home. It was what they had all said they wanted. But now, faced with the reality, many of them felt not joy, but dread. Greta stood in the mess hall, staring at the notice board where the announcement had been posted. Around her, other women whispered to each other, their faces troubled. Liesel came to stand beside her. "I thought I would be happy," Liesel said quietly. "I thought I would cry with joy at going home. But I am not happy. I am terrified." "Me too," Greta admitted, because going home meant leaving abundance for hunger. It meant trading clean beds for ruins. It meant stepping back into a world that had treated them as expendable, while the enemy had treated them with dignity. It meant carrying the burden of this truth back to a country that might not want to hear it. When the list of names was finally posted, Greta's name was on it. She would leave in 2 weeks. She stood staring at her name, feeling hollow. She should be excited. She should be counting the days. Instead, she felt only fear. That night, she wrote her final entry in the notebook. "Tomorrow I begin preparing to leave. In 2 weeks I will return to Germany, to whatever is left of my home. But I will not be the same person who left. The enemy has not broken me. The enemy has made me whole. They have shown me that even in war, even between enemies, humanity can survive. I do not know what I will find at home. But I know I will carry this lesson with me forever. Kindness is not weakness. Dignity is not defeat. And sometimes the enemy teaches us more about ourselves than our friends ever could." She closed the notebook and held it against her chest. Outside, the Louisiana night was cold and clear, stars brilliant in the dark sky, and inside Greta sat on her bunk and wept, not for what she was leaving behind in the camp, but for the innocence she could never reclaim, and for the truth she could never unknow. The transport ship left New Orleans on a gray December morning. Greta stood on the deck with dozens of other women, watching the American coastline shrink behind them. The journey to Germany would take weeks, crossing the Atlantic in winter, but this time they traveled as repatriated prisoners, not fresh captives. They had Red Cross blankets, decent food, and space to move around, but there was no joy in the journey. The women spoke little, each lost in her own thoughts. They were going home to a country they no longer recognized, to families who had suffered unimaginable hardships, while they had been relatively comfortable in American captivity. The guilt was a physical weight. Liesel spent most of the journey seasick, but Greta suspected it was not just the rough seas making her ill. It was dread. Frida paced the deck for hours each day, smoking cigarette after cigarette, staring at the gray ocean. Hilda, the teacher, organized a small study group, teaching the younger women English, insisting that language skills would be valuable in whatever came next. As they neared Europe, the weather grew colder. Snow fell on the deck, and the women huddled in their blankets, remembering the Louisiana heat that had seemed so oppressive but now felt like a distant dream. When they finally arrived at the German port, the devastation was worse than Greta had imagined. The dock was half destroyed, patched together with temporary repairs. Beyond, the city was a landscape of rubble. Buildings stood like broken teeth against the sky. People moved through the streets like ghosts, thin and gray, their faces hollow with hunger and loss. The women disembarked in silence. Red Cross workers met them, offering weak tea and directions to displaced person centers, where they could get information about their families. Greta clutched her small bag and stepped onto German soil for the first time in over 6 months. It felt foreign. Wrong. It took Greta 3 days to make her way from the port to Hamburg. The trains barely ran, and when they did, they were overcrowded and slow. She rode with hundreds of others, all traveling to find what remained of their lives. The countryside rolled past the windows, scarred with bomb craters and abandoned military equipment. Hamburg was worse than she had feared. The beautiful city she had known was gone, replaced by an apocalyptic wasteland. Entire neighborhoods had been burned to the ground in firestorms. The famous churches were skeletal ruins. People lived in cellars and lean-tos built from rubble. She found her family in the basement of a partially destroyed building near what had once been their neighborhood. When her sister opened the door and saw her, the girl screamed and threw herself into Greta's arms. Her mother emerged from the shadows, skeletal and aged beyond her years. "You are alive," her mother whispered. "We thought you were dead." The reunion was overwhelming, but it was also painful. Her family was starving. Her sister, who had been plump and cheerful before the war, was now a thin wraith with brittle hair and hollow cheeks. Her younger brother, only 9 years old, had the distended belly of severe malnutrition. They were surviving on rations from the occupying forces and whatever they could scavenge or trade. That first night, Greta shared the food she had brought with her, saved from her final days at the camp and carefully hoarded for this moment. Her family ate with desperate hunger, and Greta watched with a breaking heart. She thought of the mess hall in Louisiana, the abundance, the waste. She thought of the food she had eaten every day, food that could have fed her family for months. Her mother noticed her tears. "What is wrong? Are you hurt?" Greta shook her head. "I am fine. I am just glad to be home." But it was a lie. She was not glad. She was devastated. The contrast between her months of captivity and her family's suffering was too stark, too painful. The guilt threatened to drown her. In the weeks and months that followed, Greta tried to rebuild a life in the ruins of Hamburg. She worked in a hospital, caring for the sick and injured with medical supplies provided by the occupying forces. She stood in bread lines. She learned to stretch rations to feed her family. She lived the reality of defeated Germany. But she was changed. Her family noticed it. Her sister asked her once what the American camp had been like, and Greta struggled to answer. How could she explain that she had been treated better by the enemy than by her own government? How could she describe the soap, the chocolate, the sanitary napkins handed to her with quiet dignity? She told her sister small truths. They fed us well. They did not hurt us. They were not what we were told they would be. Her sister stared at her. But they are the enemy. They destroyed our city. We destroyed our city, Greta said quietly. We started this war. We believed in it. We cheered for it. And when we lost, we paid the price. The Americans just ended what we began. Her sister did not respond. The truth was too bitter. Years later, when her sister had children of her own, she asked Greta about the war again. By then, Germany had begun to rebuild. The occupying forces had helped establish a new government, a democracy, and while life was still hard, it was no longer desperate. Her sister's children were healthy, well-fed, free. Greta told them the story then. She told them about being captured, about expecting cruelty and receiving kindness. She told them about the soap and the hot water, about the chocolate and the meals, about the American soldiers who had treated them not as enemies but as human beings. And she told them about the sanitary napkins, the small act of dignity that had broken through her propaganda-fed hatred and forced her to see the truth. The hardest thing to carry, she said, is not cruelty. Cruelty you can hate, cruelty you can resist. The hardest thing to carry is kindness from those you were taught to hate, because kindness demands that you question everything. It demands that you see your enemy as human, and once you do that, you can never go back to the simple certainty of hatred. Her sister's children listened, wide-eyed. One of them, a girl of about 12, asked, "What did you learn from it, Aunt Greta?" Greta thought for a long moment. "I learned that dignity is stronger than cruelty. I learned that even enemies can show mercy. And I learned that sometimes the people you were told to hate can teach you more about humanity than the people you were told to love." She paused, then added, "And I learned never to believe anyone who tells you that an entire people are monsters. Because monsters do not hand out soap and sanitary napkins to prisoners. People do. And once you recognize someone as a person, everything changes." And so the soap, the chocolate, and the small brown packages of sanitary napkins became more than just physical objects. They became proof that even in war, even in the midst of hatred and destruction, human dignity can survive. For those 247 German women prisoners, the simple act of being treated with basic respect by their captors became a transformative experience that challenged everything they had been taught. The Americans had not shown kindness to manipulate or to win propaganda victories. They had shown kindness because they believed that all people, even enemies, even prisoners, deserved basic human dignity. And that belief, more than any weapon, changed hearts and minds. Greta carried that lesson with her for the rest of her long life. She told her story to her nieces and nephews, to students at the schools where she worked, to anyone who would listen. And always her message was the same. Hatred is easy. It is comfortable. It asks nothing of you but your fear and your anger. But kindness, real kindness, even to enemies, demands courage. It demands that you see past uniforms and flags to the human being underneath. And that, she said, is the hardest and most important thing we can ever do. As she told her niece many years later in a conversation that would be remembered and recorded, they could have brutalized us. They could have humiliated us. We were the enemy, and we had caused so much death and destruction. They would have been justified in their cruelty. But instead they gave us soap, food, and dignity. And that kindness was harder to bear than any punishment could have been, because it forced us to confront the truth about ourselves, about our country, and about the lies we had believed. And that is the story worth remembering. It is a reminder that even in the darkest times, even between enemies, humanity can survive. It is a reminder that small acts of dignity, like handing out sanitary napkins to women who had gone without for years, can have a profound impact that echoes through generations. If you found this story meaningful and want to hear more untold accounts from World War II, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. These stories, though buried in time, still speak to us today about the power of human dignity, the danger of propaganda, and the possibility of change. Thank you for watching, and remember, kindness is not weakness. It is the strongest weapon of all.